What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here as always. Just wanted to let you guys know this is going to be a compilation video. My throat is acting up a little bit. I tried to record, but it just wasn't sounding right, and I don't think you guys would enjoy listening to that. It was acting up a little bit yesterday too, so I'm just gonna take a break for tonight, and hopefully we'll be back to normal by tomorrow. I'll only have ads after the first 2 stories in this one, since it's a mid-week compilation instead of the usual end-of-week one. I hope you guys will still enjoy it and use it in the background or to fall asleep or whatever you may. And I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you guys for understanding. Growing up, I had a best friend named Lloyd. We grew up as regular old country boys, having all sorts of fun together. We collected baseball cards, played with our toy guns, went to the pool. We did just about everything together. When my dad took me out hunting for the first time, Lloyd came along then as well. Growing up, we really were inseparable. This happened when the 2 of us were in high school. Lloyd and I lived just off a rural route way out of town. This was a very poor area, and we both lived in pretty old, run-down houses. This was in the 1980s. We had grown up in the 70s and early 80s. My family was fortunate enough to have a color television, but we didn't have anything like cable. That didn't matter too much to us kids, though, because most of the stuff we did was outside. It was a really hot summer night when this happened. Lloyd was over at my house, which was usual. We were both 16 years old at the time. We had been in my room listening to music together pretty much all night long. After a while, though, we began to get a little bit bored. Lloyd wanted to smoke a couple of joints that he had on him. He thought that we could get away with it in my room, but there was no way I was going to let him do that here. I couldn't take the chance of my dad smelling it. I didn't really know if he would have gotten in trouble for it or not, but it was not a chance I was willing to take. We lived right on the edge of a huge forest. It was a place we had explored in, hunted in, hung out in, and even smoked joints in before. I let Lloyd know that if he really wanted to smoke so badly, then we should probably go for a quick walk in the woods. It was already past midnight, but that was no big deal to us. We had often gone for walks really late at night before. My dad was still awake, watching television. We let him know that we were bored and going for a quick walk. He didn't really care all that much, just told us to be careful and take a flashlight with us. He also suggested I take my rifle out with me as well, which I decided to do just to make him happy. Since we lived in an extremely rural area, it wasn't unusual for a kid my age to have his own gun. We set out and began smoking as soon as we got out into the woods. It was extremely dark outside, so we had to use the flashlights right away. There were some paths to walk on, created by years of people simply walking through the forest. We just walked along those, deeper and deeper into the trees. For a while, the walk was just a normal walk. We didn't have anything happen or hear anything out of the ordinary. After a while, though, we noticed something lying off to the side of the path we were on. As we got a bit closer, we were pretty shocked by what we saw. There was a dead deer just lying on the ground. That in itself was not unusual, but it was cut up pretty bad. It was like some animal had killed and mauled it only in the area it was wounded in. What was especially weird was that many of the edible parts of the deer were left over as well. It seemed strange to both of us that any animal would have done this and left so much meat there. "Hey, what if we run into a bobcat or something that did this?" Lloyd asked me. I held up my rifle. "That's what we have this for." Don't misunderstand me, however. I wasn't going looking for something to kill. I would just absolutely use my rifle to protect myself from whatever was out there. We didn't think a whole lot more about it, and kept walking through the woods and smoking. Now, though, we were listening to the noises around us much more closely. We were talking about the possibility of a bobcat, and I guess the more we talked about it, the more we convinced ourselves one might be out there. We were not too scared, though. I don't know how long we were out or when we decided to turn around and head back toward my house. but eventually we did so. It was pretty late into the night. We were pretty stoned at that point too, but no more than we were used to being. It was on the way back that Lloyd began to get a little bit paranoid. He kept on telling me he was hearing things out in the woods. I wasn't hearing any of the noises he described myself, and I told him he was just being paranoid because he was stoned. He was absolutely confident, though, that he was hearing something out there. He was confident something was walking the woods with us. He began getting really worried that another animal was out there, stalking us. I still couldn't hear the noises he'd been talking about, though. The more we walked along, the more paranoid he got. He kept asking me, whispering over and over, "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" I hadn't heard any of the things he was talking about, though. When we crossed back toward the area we'd originally seen that deer, we were surprised to see it was already no longer there. This just increased Lloyd's paranoia, and he began scanning the area, trying to see if an animal had dragged it off somewhere. "Holy shit," I heard his whisper as he grabbed my arm. Lloyd made me look over into the woods, but wouldn't shine his light in that direction. Although it was dark, I could see what looked like a large figure somewhere out in the woods. It was moving around, too. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it over at whatever it was that we were looking at. We saw the deer, and whatever this big figure was obviously pulling it. It quickly darted out of the way before we could fully shine the light upon it. However, we had both seen this. For the first time, I was just as scared as Lloyd, or perhaps even more. I didn't know who or what we just saw, but after what we remembered from seeing the deer and what we had seen in the dark, I knew someone or something was out there. To let them know we were armed, I took my rifle and fired one shot into the air, hoping that would scare whatever it was away. "We need to get out of here," Lloyd told me. I agreed, and the two of us began jogging along the path to get out of the woods. We were scared of that thing that might have killed that deer. We wanted to get as far away from it as possible. We didn't know if it tried following us, but we got out of the woods as fast as we could. What we had seen was not very far from the house either. We both rushed in and locked the doors behind us. It was hot outside, and we usually kept the doors open. They were usually left unlocked, too, so this was a very rare thing. The two of us went and hid out in my room and kept the gun with us, fully loaded. We didn't sleep at all that night. I guess that really shouldn't be surprising, though. About a month later, this really huge guy was arrested in those woods, not far from our house. Apparently, he'd attacked a police officer who had stopped to question him. I have no doubt it was the very same person we saw that night. I always used to enjoy taking my dog on a walk through the woods every day. I lived out in the country by myself. For the most part, when I took my dog for a walk, I would take him through the same area every time. One day, however, I decided to travel out in a completely different direction, and that resulted in me seeing the strangest thing I had ever seen in my life. It was nothing more than a decision made out of boredom, but I took my dog alongside the dirt roads past the driveway, then out into the hills that were opposite my house. Like my normal walks, we were out there for quite a long time. We weren't hunting or anything, but my dog and I like to take really long walks in the country as if we were. I didn't even have to leash him, as he never went too far from me, and he always came back right away when I called. Beside being a little more dense than the forest we usually walked in, this was not too much of a different journey. We were having a good time walking through the woods and enjoying what we were seeing. My dog, Roscoe, had been running around looking at various things. He had beaten me over the top of the hill, and I was trying to get up there to check on him. Before I even made it to the top, though, he came running back over the hill to me. When he caught up to me, he turned and tried to lead me up the hill all over again. "Did you find something interesting, boy?" I asked him. Roscoe turned and began running back over the hill. I stepped up my pace and made it over as well to see where he was going. Once I made it over, I noticed something that really surprised me. It looked like there was an old cabin on the other side of the hill. Since Roscoe was over right by this cabin, I figured that must be what he was barking about. I really didn't want to bother whoever was living out in the woods like that. I knew better than to get involved with those people. I tried calling Roscoe over and over, trying to get him to come back to me, but for some reason he would not do it. I was very nervous as I walked up to him. He wasn't barking or anything, so it was possible anyone living inside hadn't heard him yet. I tried my best to be as quiet as possible and tried to go up to Roscoe so I could grab him by the collar and lead him away. As I got up to him, though, I looked over to the other side of the cabin that I hadn't seen before, and that's when I noticed something really strange. There was a tree that was really close by the side of the cabin. Hanging from this tree were all sorts of shoes. They were all different kinds and pairs, most of them in many different sizes. They all had their strings tied together, and then the strings were tied to different branches on the tree. Most of them looked like they'd been up there for a long time, heavily beaten by the weather. Some of the shoes on that tree, however, looked like they had been put there more recently and were not as weathered by the elements. All in all, it was the weirdest thing I had ever seen, and the most disturbing thing as well. I tried to be as quiet as I could as I led Roscoe away from the area. I thought if I led him down the hill, we could get back to the road and take that back home. As we kept on going downward, though, I smelled something pretty nasty. It got worse and worse until we got to the very bottom of the hill. At the bottom, I saw the most disgusting thing I had ever seen in my life. There was a pile of what appeared to be rotted and decaying roadkill or something of the like at the bottom of that hill. It was vile, and I had to do everything I could to keep from puking. I grabbed Roscoe by the collar and quickly led him away. We eventually got back to the dirt road. I used it and took my dog home with me. I don't know exactly what I saw that day. Between the weird shoe tree and that pile of decaying meat, it was the weirdest shit. But then again, a lot of times if you go hiking where you're not supposed to, you'll find the weirdest sights. I inherited my parents' home when they both passed away when I was in my early 20s. I was not in a relationship and didn't have any children either, so I moved in all alone. It was a pretty big house to live in alone, but I didn't want to get rid of it or sell it or anything like that. And because of that, I stayed there for a very long time by myself. I was a single female living in a big house in town all by my lonesome. My next-door neighbors, or at least the ones who owned the house at the time, did not live there. They rented the house out to several people throughout the time I had been living there. I'd had neighbors that I played with their children while growing up, and I also had people who lived there who we never even spoke a word to at all. When I owned the house, not much had changed. Well, about 2 years after I inherited it initially, the people who rented the house next door moved out, and it stayed empty for about a month or so. When someone new finally moved in, I came outside onto the porch to see who it was. I always liked to greet whoever moved in. Like my house, it was a big 3-bedroom family-sized home, so I expected a family to be moving in. When I went over to greet the man who I saw moving things in, I quickly realized he was moving in all by himself. He did not have anyone else moving in with him. And it wasn't surprising why. There was immediately something very off and very creepy about this guy. I noticed it right away. He wasn't talkative at all, and kept looking at me in a way that made me feel very strange. When I excused myself and went back to my home, I just decided this was not going to be one of the more friendly neighborhood relationships I was going to have there. It didn't really bother me much though, because I figured that like most neighbors over the years, he wouldn't be here forever anyway. Things continued to be strange with him as the weeks passed by. He wouldn't really ever talk to me. If I came out of the house though, and he was on his porch. He would stare at me the entire time I was outside. His eyes would always follow me to my car and watch me whenever I drove away. I guess I should have worried about him breaking into my house and stealing my stuff or something, but I never did. I could always tell from his eyes that that sort of thing was not important to him. He seemed like he was interested in me for some reason. After some time of things keeping up like that, I came to the conclusion that he was harmless enough. Not so long after that, though, I had seen him watching me from one of the windows of his house whenever he could catch a glimpse of me. That was much creepier than him just watching me from his porch, but I tried not to think about it too much. One night, about 7 months after he moved in, I'd gotten home pretty late from work. I just wanted to have a couple of glasses of wine and take a quick bath. I was doing a good job at finally relaxing after a very stressful work day. My bathroom was on the second floor of the house. After I was done with my bath, I dried off and put on my robe. I decided to go down to the second floor and grab myself another glass of wine. I was walking around in the dark like I tend to do. I have somewhat good night vision. I got the bottle out of the refrigerator and poured a glass, keeping the door open. Then I placed the bottle back inside. When this refrigerator door was open, it faced the back of my house and blocked my back door. I closed it, and the kitchen went dark again when the light inside went out. After the couple of seconds it took for my eyes to adjust, I saw something out the back window. It was only for a few moments, but I was sure of it. There was a man who was looking in the back window of my house, and there was no doubt at all it must be my next-door neighbor. Within a moment of me catching sight of him, he was already gone. Now, I didn't scream or panic or anything, but I did grab my phone and call the police. I let them know exactly what I had seen. I didn't have any proof that the man was at my back door, but in a moment of irony, I really didn't need it actually. The scariest revelation of my life also ended up being the very thing that helped me. The police revealed to me that my neighbor was a convicted sex offender. The reason they didn't need proof that he was at my door to arrest him was because he'd actually failed to register long before he moved in. He went to jail and was evicted as my neighbor. I was scared to death when I was told this by police. It made me think of the possibilities with a person like that living next door. It's a good thing they caught him when they did. This story happened when I was about 13 or 14. I grew up in a town with a lot of walking/biking trails in a forest area about a 10-minute walk away from my house. I spent a lot of time outside because of this. One of my best friends, we'll call him Anthony, lived in the neighborhood just across from mine. I would walk frequently to his house, knock on his door, and see whether he wanted to join me in biking aimlessly around town. On this particular day, he decided to join me, and we went down to the local lake, an extremely popular spot during the summer. It's basically never empty. There's a trail right next to the local library, which leads down to the lake. We decided to hang out by the trail entrance, as it was right next to a tunnel that ran under the street above, providing some pretty good shade and amplification for listening to music together off our iPods. This tunnel was probably a good 20 feet long or so, with the only easy path back up to the street above being the paved one on one side. The trail itself was made of gravel, with heavy trees on both sides. No easy way to get off with a bike, unless you use the designated entrances and exits. Anthony and I were hanging out on the opposite side of the tunnel from the trail entrance, so as to not bother any families getting on the trail with our music. We had our bikes leaned up on the side of the tunnel, when I noticed a man coming through on the opposite end, right next to the trail entrance. He entered the tunnel, and once he was about 15 feet away, he called out to us, "I'm a city name, police officer." It didn't take more than a 2-second glance to tell you he obviously was not. He was wearing cargo shorts, a green tank top, sandals, and a big military-style backpack. Even from about 15 feet away, I could tell his skin was really greasy and his hair was unkempt as well. I immediately knew something bad was about to happen, and my adrenaline started to rush. I turned to my friend and yelled at him to run, to which he hopped on his bike and began to ride off. The man was standing between us and the trail entrance, so there was no easy way for us to take off without either needing to go directly past him or down the trail in the opposite direction. Anthony chose to ride for the main entrance that the man was blocking. As he rode past, the man reached out and grabbed his arm. Anthony sort of stopped, but the man seemed to be more focused on me and ended up letting go, after which Anthony quickly took off. I knew I wouldn't be as lucky as he was though if I tried to push my way past the man. Immediately I started looking for other ways to run. I noticed there was actually a small dirt trail on the same end of the tunnel we'd been on. I tried to take my bike up it, and the man yelled after me, "Didn't your parents ever teach you not to run from the fucking cops?" The trail was too small for me to carry my bike down, so I just dropped it on the ground and continued running on foot, hoping this side trail led back up to the street, where he at least wouldn't be able to hurt me without any witnesses. He chased me about halfway down the trail, but eventually turned around. I ended up coming out at the library and quickly ran to the top of the tunnel so I could see what he was doing. All I saw was him riding off on my bike. I called the cops, and they came to my house to give me a lineup after I walked home. I instantly identified the guy. Apparently, he and his twin brother were homeless and on meth, which would explain his demeanor and motivation. They were known for stealing bikes in the area, but never so brazenly. I was just glad the situation wasn't worse, because based on his substance use, he could have easily chosen violence at the drop of a hat. This happened about 30 years ago, when I was in my early 20s or so. Back then, I lived in a very rural area. It was not easy to find jobs at the time, especially in the area I lived in. It was just outside of a very small town, which had long ago died out. Most of the business in this small town had closed down, and the few jobs that actually did exist around here were already filled. It was impossible to even find a job at the local McDonald's. That's how bad it was. I was able, though, thanks to a friend, to find a job in a factory eventually. It wasn't the most ideal job in the world, though, due to multiple things. First off, it was a third shift job, and I was not used to working overnight. That wasn't so bad, though, compared to the fact that it was a nearly hour-and-a-half drive just in order to get to and from work. It paid decently though, and I really needed the work, so I took this job. I was able to take turns driving with my buddy who'd initially gotten me the job, so that saved us some gas money at least. It wasn't really too terrible, at the time anyway. Now, the job itself might be a setting for a pretty scary story in itself. I mean, it was a factory, and it didn't do any production during the third shift. There were a few maintenance workers there and a few security guards as well. I was one of those security guards. Other than that, though, the huge factory was largely dark and empty. That's not where this scary story took place, though. Me and my buddy Tony had been driving to work 5 days a week for several months now, through the summer, when this story took place. We had to get to the factory and signed in and everything by midnight, so we tended to leave just before 10 p.m. It was a fall day, and it was obviously a very rural drive to the factory. To set the scene, it was very chilly outside. The leaves were falling from the trees pretty heavily. Although it wasn't raining hard or anything, it was very misty and damp outside that night. This day, Tony was driving us in his old pickup truck. It was a really small and old Isuzu truck, so not anything special. Usually, the roads were pretty dead, and a long portion of the drive was through the hills. After a short period of time, though, we realized there was a car behind us. It wasn't too big a deal, just a bit unusual. However, the guy kept switching his lights from his regular beams to his high beams every now and then. After having the high beams on for a few moments, he would put them back to normal. Since Tony was driving, this was annoying him a lot more than it was annoying me. After a while, he got sick of it and slammed the brakes on his car. This caused the car, which had been following us for quite a while at this point, to hit its brakes as well. We heard it skid a bit on the slick roads. Tony was pretty happy with himself. Still, it didn't do any good though. The car continued following us and continued occasionally flipping back and forth from his regulars to his high beams and back again. Tony was getting annoyed, but I tried to convince him not to go and just slam his brakes again. The road was too slippery, and I didn't want to take the chance that somebody would skid off the road. I'm not too sure how long that car had followed us through the hills, when suddenly something really weird happened. Some lights in the car began flashing on and off. This was a regular car though, not a police car, and the lights were pure white, not red and blue. They were flashing from inside the car though, like they were police lights. The car also began flashing its high beams even faster. Tony wasn't sure what to do, but we decided just in case this guy was an unmarked cop car or something, we should at least pull over first. If he wasn't, we would just drive off after, and it would be the end of the annoying encounter. Well, Tony pulled the truck over, and the other car pulled over as well. This time, he kept his high beams on, plus the white lights were still flashing in his car. I was convinced now, though, that this was not a police car. The lights were simply strobe lights. The whole thing seemed weird, and it made no sense that if this guy was a cop, that any of this behavior would even be occurring. The driver hopped out of the car and began walking over. I watched him closely from the back window of the cab of this little truck. It happened for just a moment, too. I saw the man was holding what looked like a rifle, and he was holding it like he was preparing to fire right now. I smacked Tony on the arm. "That's not a cop," I told him. "Drive away now!" Tony looked confused, but I urged him to hurry. He slapped the car in drive and began pulling away from the side of the street. Almost immediately, we heard a shot fired from the rifle of the man. We both flinched, worried about getting hit, but we seemed to be okay. Tony slammed on the gas, and even though that little old truck didn't have much power to it, we took off right away. I kept watching at the back window. I kept expecting to see this car, with its high beams and flashing lights following us. I was sure it was not a cop now, but they would absolutely begin following us. However, after we lost sight of the car, we didn't see it again after that. We knew then for sure it was definitely no good. We kept driving to work. We didn't know what to do, really. We didn't see much point in reporting it to the police. We had almost no information on the vehicle, so we didn't see how it would do any good. Instead, we just kept driving and went to work like nothing ever happened. Tony and I never found out anything about what happened that night, but being fired at, even though the truck had not been hit, was a very scary experience. We never experienced anything like that ever again either. My brother and I used to work security at this really old quarry. I never really quite understood the job, to tell you the truth. If you had seen the quarry at any time during the day, you would have just assumed it to be abandoned. It truly came across that way. It seemed there was no real work being done there except every once in a great while. However, there were always 2 security guards who were there in the morning and overnight. There was a period of time, though, from about 6 p.m. until the 2 of us arrived at 8 p.m., that there was no one present at all. My brother Travis and I were headed into work that evening. It was a hot summer day, and we really weren't looking forward to the job. It mostly consisted of us sitting in a small building all night that was not air-conditioned, and sometimes walking around the quarry to make sure there were no intruders. I never understood, though, why anyone would break into the place at the first place. There was a bunch of nothing there to steal even. We got to work a little bit before 8 p.m., and we noticed something quite strange right away. The entrance gates were wide open. We'd had them unlocked before. The daytime security guards were not the greatest or most diligent workers in the world, but this was the first time they'd ever been wide open. We didn't really think too much about it, really. We drove in and Travis got out, closed the gates up behind and locked them. After we got settled in, Travis liked to go ahead and do a sweep of the quarry before it got too dark outside. I let him do it, and I went to go get things settled in the building. It was maybe 20 minutes later when Travis suddenly came running into the door. He was very flustered and winded. At first, I couldn't make out what was wrong with him. When he finally took the chance to breathe, he told me he'd just found a dead body out in the quarry. He said the person looked like they'd been killed very recently too. Travis was pretty freaked out, so I asked him where this body was. I told him to go ahead and call the police right now, then call our boss to let him know. I was going to go and check out this body for myself. By this point, it was definitely getting dark out. I took out my flashlight and began to head to the area where he said he'd found it at. When I got there, I began shining my flashlight all around. It was dark, but I noticed what he'd found pretty quickly. When I did, though, I also noticed there was a person crouched over the body. I only saw the person clearly for one moment, but he looked like he was going through the person's pockets. When my flashlight hit him, he took off pretty quickly out of the area. Yes, I was a security guard, but I had no idea what to do. I had a gun, but I wasn't allowed to just shoot the intruder, even if they might be a killer. I was not a cop, and I knew I could get into a lot of trouble for shooting at someone, whether the person was suspected of murder or not. I decided to chase after the figure. I hadn't got a look at the body, so I didn't know for sure how they'd been killed. I just hoped the figure I was chasing didn't have a weapon. If they didn't, that would be the best advantage I had. I ran in that direction and realized the person was gunning for the fence. He had a head start on me, and he was a bit faster than I was as well. He got to the fence and began climbing before I got there. By the time I got another glimpse of him, he'd already climbed to the very top. I shined my flashlight right in his face, and that seemed to catch him off guard. He almost fell off on the other side of the fence. He caught himself, however, and jumped off and ran into the night. I wasn't about to jump the gate and chase the guy that far, though. It was one thing for me to be patrolling within the fenced area where I worked, but this guy could have been long gone before I even got my ass over that fence. I went back to the gate at the road and waited for the police to arrive. It did take them quite a while to get there, and I was sure the guy I'd chased off was way far away at this point. I was able to give the police a pretty bad description of who I'd seen. I had a few glimpses, but they weren't very long. Travis, on the other hand, hadn't seen the possible killer at all. The scariest part for my brother, however, was that apparently the person had been killed right around the time he started his patrol. The police theorized that since the killer had come back to the body after my brother left, my brother must have gotten there right after the murder and scared the guy off. The man had been killed with a knife, so the killer might have been scared if he knew we had guns or something. Travis was quite shaken by what he was told, but he tried his best to brush it off. The experience has shaken us both enough that we couldn't keep working at that quarry. We didn't want to be there, just in case the guy decided to come back with others or something and finish the job. I grew up in a house way out in the middle of nowhere. I really didn't care for it too much, and I currently live in the city. Although, I guess for the most part, it's much more dangerous generally in the city, I like the area a lot more. The area I lived in back then was called Greasy Ridge, and it was in southern Ohio. Our house was all alone at the very top of a hill. My closest friends lived all the way down the hill, which would take about 20 minutes to walk down the road and get to their house. The school bus that would take us to school would take about an hour and 15 minutes to get us there. Although I wasn't really always happy living out in the country like that, the best thing about it compared to the city was that it seemed relatively safe. I mean, we left our doors unlocked all the time. It really wasn't something we normally even thought about. When I was 14 years old, my parents and my younger sister were going to visit family across the river in West Virginia. Normally, that meant that my cousin would be watching my sister while all the parents went out drinking. I mean, there was no telling when they would be getting back, so I decided to stay home instead. I figured I would just watch some TV or movies by myself. It was pretty late at night when I was sitting on the sofa watching television. Our living room faced the front of the house. We had a very big picture window facing the front of the house as well. Our driveway was also pretty long. It was probably getting close to 11 p.m. when I saw a car pull into our driveway and begin making its way up to our house. Now, I doubted this could be my parents. There was no way they would be coming back this early on a drinking night. Other than them, though, I had no idea who this could possibly be. When the car got closer, I was able to see it was some sort of pickup truck. Two big older men got out of it and began walking up to the door. I went and met them at the door, and they asked me if someone named Troy was at the house. I told them that no one with that name lived here. Almost immediately, the men began getting angry with me. They told me I was lying and that they knew Troy was home. How dare I lie to them and tell them Troy didn't live there? I was a 14-year-old country boy, so obviously I didn't like anyone speaking to me like that. I got angry and told them that no one with that name fucking lived here and to get the hell off my property or else. Even at age 14 though, I should have known that was a stupid thing to do. I hadn't opened the screen door of the house, and one of the guys began reaching for the handle. I then quickly shut the front door, locked it, and bolted it. The two guys pounded on the door and were demanding me to open it up for a few moments. I simply told them to go fuck themselves. Looking out the window, I saw them walk away from the door. They went walking back to their truck, and at first I expected them to get in and drive away. But they didn't. They grabbed some huge object from the bed of the truck and began walking back toward the house. I wasn't really scared, but I was somewhat concerned. These were big and scary-looking guys. I began closing the drapes on the picture window, but before I could get the drapes all the way closed, the big object came flying through. I only had a few moments to think, and I did as quickly as I could. I figured the two men were going to try and come in through the recently broken window, so I ran into my dad's room. My dad was really old school country. He kept his shotgun at all times in his bedroom, fully loaded. He taught me to use it from a really young age, so I knew I had that gun there to protect me. I grabbed the gun and ran back to the living room. The guys were both in there, and one of them had a baseball bat. I, of course, had a boomstick with me. "Where's Troy?" one of them asked, before seeing the gun in my hands. They both took a step back. "Get the fuck out of my house or I'll mount your head on my wall," I told them, leveling my gun at them. "You ain't gonna shoot," one of them began, before I pulled the trigger and fired right past his head as a warning. They both took my warning seriously and fled back through the window. Rather than going to the window myself, I went over to the front door and opened it. I went out on the porch. I was first worried that they might go and get a gun out of their truck too, but they didn't. They got into the truck and began pulling out. Being the so-called tough guys they probably considered themselves to be, they began screaming threats as they pulled out. Another shot from my shotgun at their car silenced their asses real quick though. I couldn't get in touch with my parents, and it took the police a while to get there. I gave them good descriptions. I knew both cops as well, since I went to school with their younger siblings. They found my story quite humorous actually, and I got some respect from them for doing what I did. The two guys were found, but they were just warned, not arrested. This was not really unusual for the area that we lived in though. They did have to pay to get the window replaced, and we were told if they didn't, they would let my dad deal with them any way he wanted to. Troy was some guy who lived out on the ridge, I found out. I never knew him though. These guys had gotten the wrong house. I, 30 and female, live in a relatively safe neighborhood, barring the occasional mugging attempts, one of which took place right against my bedroom window with one of my neighbors. There's also the few times a random guy in his car followed me to my place, asking for my phone number. Otherwise, things are generally stable though. I typically have a way of dealing with those assholes anyway, by taking advantage of this random empty lot on my street, where cars can't drive through, forcing them to go around the entire block. By the time they managed to turn around the corner and try to cut me off or whatever, I would already have run back into my house and disappeared. No biggie. A few months ago, some genius in our street paid someone in the city to move the neighborhood garbage disposer to another place, whereas before it was right down the block. Now it was a few minutes walk away. Now I have to walk a while before I can throw out my garbage, usually in quite a busy area as well, which I find somewhat embarrassing. I started waiting until nightfall to do so because of this. I know that's stupid with everything I told you just before, but I got sloppy and things started feeling safer in the last few months. Because of this, I felt very comfortable leaving my home after sundown. Until last Sunday at least. Like usual, I waited until it was dark to go. After throwing the garbage out, I stopped by the convenience store nearby to pick up some things on my way back. As I was returning to my place though, at the entrance of my street, I noticed a young man standing in front of a parking lot located in front of one of my neighbor's houses, right across the street from where I lived. He was talking on the phone and looking away from me. As I rounded the corner though, I also noticed a guy sitting quietly on his motorbike right in front of my doorstep. There was something about the way he was already looking right at me, just as my eyes landed on him, that really freaked me out. I did some quick math and realized that by the time I would be able to open the door, if ever, this guy could easily catch me if he wanted to. This time, the empty lot trick was not going to work. I would have to walk past this guy anyway, but also his motorbike could just be driven into it easily. I turned on my heels and started to head back to the convenience store, hoping he was just a delivery guy waiting for someone or something. I dilly-dallied at the store for a while, but when I went back home, I found the man was still there waiting on his bike, while the guy in front of my neighbor's lot was still on his phone, or at least pretending to be, staring at me before I'd even seen him. I realized that something was not quite right here. Luckily, I noticed the security guard of the street was behind us, sitting right in his booth. I quickly approached him and explained the situation, hoping he'd at least walk me to my place, which he gladly did. The moment the guy on the phone saw me return with the security guard, he slipped his phone in his pocket and turned towards the guy on the bike. The guy on the bike then drove off with him. Keep in mind, these two had not ever looked at one another, let alone indicated they knew each other whatsoever. The guy who was on his phone sat behind the motorbike dude, and they shot past me while staring at me. Both the security guard and I agreed that something was funny about the situation. Thankfully, he waited with me until I was safely behind locked doors. I don't know if those two wanted to mug me or what, but I'm glad I trusted my gut and didn't just go home with those guys right there. Otherwise, who knows what would have happened. In my college, all freshmen had to live in the dorms, and they had to live in either a double or a triple. I was a bit nervous about sharing the room with another person, and this only got even worse when I met the guy to be my roommate. This guy was named Kyle, and Kyle was really weird. He was sort of dark. I don't mean to say he was a goth or anything like that, because that's not really what I mean. I mean, yeah, he did wear dark clothes and had dark makeup as well, but he was just so weird. He took it to a level that was much more than just an odd fashion statement here and there. He was involved with what he believed to be witchcraft, and I'm not just talking about Wicca or that sort of thing. He called the witchcraft he believed in black magic, and very often referred to entities he would pray to. and demons and that sort of thing. Now, I'm not particularly religious or anything, but everything he did just made me really uncomfortable. Things with Kyle were at first just annoying. He would always be awake at all times of night, and I always had to be up early for class the next day. He would sit at this little altar thing he'd made and talk to these demons by candlelight. He kept me awake all throughout the night, so I took to wearing earplugs and an eye mask to try and get at least some sleep. One night, though, I was woken up by a lot of noise that even my earplugs couldn't keep out. When I peeked out from under my mask, Kyle was having a three-way with another girl and guy on his bed. I just put my mask back on and pretended I'd never seen anything. So far, it had only been minor annoyances, but it turned very scary one day. I got home from class, and Kyle, who usually didn't pay much attention to me before, seemed really excited to see me. He told me he was communicating with one of his demons, and he needed someone's blood in order to do this further. He just straight up asked me if he could have some of mine. I turned him down, of course, and he insisted it would not hurt at all. I told him I wasn't really concerned about the pain. I didn't want him to use my blood for some nefarious ritual or something. He just kept on begging for my blood for a while, but I didn't relent at all. When he gave up finally, I could tell he was extremely pissed off at me. I didn't really care though, because at least he left me alone for the rest of the night. As usual that night, I went to bed with my earplugs and my mask on. I'm not sure how long I'd been sleeping before I felt a sudden and sharp pain surge up in my arm. I jumped up in bed, ripping my eye mask off immediately. There was a large slash in my arm, and Kyle was kneeling next to my bed, holding a ceremonial knife. The guy had actually sliced me open and started to collect my blood in my sleep. Enraged, I kicked him in the head, which knocked him down to the floor. I kicked the knife out of his hand and ran out the door. I ran straight to the RAS room and pounded on the door frantically. She answered and saw the huge slash in my arm. She called the campus police. Kyle was arrested soon after, and you can be damn sure I pressed charges against him. I know after he was taken out of my room, and I assume he was removed from the school as well. I don't technically know for sure exactly what happened though. I'm just happy I never saw that psychopath again though. I knew right away I was gonna have problems when I started living in the dorms. Growing up, I'd always had a room of my own, and being with another person was gonna be pretty hard to get used to already. When I first met my new roommate, he was actually a really nice guy. His name was Josh, and we got along really well. Still, it was difficult for me to always have another person hanging around all the time. There was definitely no privacy for me anymore in these small rooms either. About a month after I'd moved in, I was up studying late at night. Josh had been deep asleep for a while, when suddenly he just rose out of his bed like a zombie. He was only wearing his boxers. He got up and walked out of the room in his underwear. He didn't come back for about an hour. I tried to ask him where he'd gone like that, but he ignored me and went back to his bed, sleeping right away. The next day, I brought this up to him, and he told me he used to sleepwalk when he was little. He hadn't done this in a really long time, but had been concerned that he would start up again. He had a feeling it would start up when he went to college and added more stress to his life. He told me it was normally not that big a deal. He'd just walk and wander around for a bit and then head back to bed. He said it would be fine if I wanted to wake him up if I did anything weird. Apparently the rule that you're not supposed to wake up a sleepwalker isn't really true. Over the next few weeks, Josh did sleepwalk a few more times. I did wake him up once or twice when I thought he might get into some trouble. Sometimes, however, I couldn't. He would leave while I was sleeping, and when he came back into the room was generally when I would wake up. Anyway, the sleepwalking really wasn't that big of a deal until one particular night. Like I mentioned, it would almost always just involve him walking around in his boxers, but one night it took a really odd turn. I was deep in sleep when I began to hear some strange noises, which woke me up pretty quickly. I was still groggy and not able to pay that much attention to it until I heard the sound of something hitting the floor. Opening my eyes, I was immediately shocked. Josh had just opened the window and taken the screen off of it. He was climbing onto the windowsill of our second-story dorm room window. I jumped up to try and stop him, but before I could do anything, he fell out of the window as if it were nothing. Freaked out, I ran over and looked down. Josh was lying there in his boxers on the ground. There were a few students outside who had been unlucky enough to witness this. I ran out of the dorm still in just my boxers and sprinted down the stairs. I told the people around him that I was his roommate and that he was a sleepwalker. Fortunately, he survived the fall. Apparently, he landed on his feet, and the shock of the fall completely shattered both of his legs. Josh was okay and didn't remember anything about what had happened, or at least as okay as you can be with two completely shattered legs. I know this might not seem as scary to some of you, but you just need to imagine this picture. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night and seeing your best friend jumping out of a second-story window with no cause, as if it were nothing. I was absolutely terrified. I'm sure you've heard this sort of story 100 times before, but I think this one might be just a little bit weirder than most. Mostly that's because I live in a very rural area, and when this happened, I was in fact living out on a ridge all by myself. I won't give the name of this ridge though. I'd rather keep this strange story anonymous and not allow people to find my location. My house was way up on a hill and was about a 20-minute drive from the next closest house. We had a huge big yard, and on a clear night, you could see just about the entire Milky Way clearly. It was so dark out there, and there were no polluting lights around. Growing up in that house was great, other than that I had to get up nearly 2 hours before school started, because the bus needed a long time to get there and back. Other than that, it was pretty nice though. This happened when I was 13 years old. My parents were visiting my grandmother, and I decided not to go with them this time. Usually, I'd get pretty bored when I went there, so I stayed in the house by myself instead. I was curled up on the couch in the living room and watching various horror movies late into the night. At one point, I got a sudden phone call. I didn't think to ask who it was. It was someone who wanted to speak to my father. He didn't ask for my father by name, though. He just asked, "Hey, is your dad home?" I stupidly told him no, and that he wouldn't be home for a few days yet. The guy didn't even offer to leave a message, and just hung up immediately. I very quickly put the incident out of my mind, but about an hour later, towards the end of a very scary movie, I was startled by a sudden knock at the door. I was even more surprised because I hadn't seen the lights of a car pulling up into the driveway. It would have been very obvious if someone had driven up here. I looked over at the clock and saw it was about 11 p.m. I think anyone, especially someone who lives in a rural area, would be a bit freaked out by someone suddenly coming to knock on the door this late at night. I didn't know how to react. I thought the best idea was to just not answer the door at all. I already had all the lights off, so maybe whoever was out there wouldn't know I was home. I had the remote control on the couch, and I quickly clicked the kill button to kill the light from the television. I hid under the blanket, just in case the guy looked in through the window. When I didn't answer, whoever was outside knocked again. He waited for a few moments. I still didn't answer the second time. When I still didn't respond, the person outside began banging really hard on the door, then started yelling, "I know you're home, and I know you're alone." He kept knocking on the door over and over. You might be wondering, why didn't I call the cops in that moment? Well, remember just how far away I lived. There was no way they would get there in time. I didn't even think about going to get my dad's gun either. I just stayed under those covers, shivering as the man continued pounding on the door. There was no way in hell I was going to answer it, obviously. Eventually, the guy gave up. I heard him knocking some things over on the porch. Then it was all quiet once more. I stayed on the couch covered up and didn't dare turn the television back on either. I mean, I didn't know if the man had gone to another door or window of the house just to hide. I didn't know if he could see inside. If I moved, maybe he would see me. Eventually, after quite a long time had passed, I fell asleep out of exhaustion. I woke up in the morning as the sun began to shine into the room. I felt very relieved a few hours later when the phone started ringing. I was scared to answer it, assuming it would be the same guy again. I had put 2 and 2 together at this point and figured that person must have been the knocker. To my fortune, though, the person on the phone was not that man. I answered it and was immediately informed it was the police. An old grandmother who lived a few miles down the road in a lonely house like my own had been attacked and brutally beaten the previous night. It happened only a few hours after the knocker had left my house. They were calling to warn us that whoever did the attacking was still at large and to exercise extreme caution. I just know it was that same man. Now, first off, I'm a guy. I have to get that out of the way right away, because this is a story about pet cats, and I know a lot of people assume cats are more of a girl's pet sort of thing. I've always had a great fondness for felines. I mean, they're such beautiful animals. Sure, some of them can act really stuck up sometimes, but hey, they're cats. They have every right to do so. My parents bought me a cat when I was about 10 years old. His name was Greasy, for no better reason than I wanted to name my cat something I was sure no one else would have already done. He's still alive, actually, and is sitting next to me as I'm writing this story down. Even though I love my cat, I wanted another one as well. Cats are sort of like tattoos, in the way that you can't only have just one of them. My parents, on the other hand, didn't want me to have more than one pet. I recall around the time I was 12 or 13. One night, Greasy was getting a little more meowy than usual. He was also hanging around the front door. When I went to check out why, I noticed there was a young cat hanging out in the bush in front of our house. Having sympathy for the young creature, as well as just loving young animals in general, because he was a freaking cat especially, I decided I'd feed him a bit. I grabbed one of Greasy's extra bowls and gave the extremely hungry cat outside a small meal. The way I looked at it now was that I now had 2 cats. I named this stray cat Sebastian and even wrote the name on his bowl. I wasn't allowed to bring him into the house, obviously, and I didn't tell my parents much about him. I enjoyed my stray cat, though. He was awesome, and it was nice having one cat inside and one outside. My parents went to bed early because they often got up early for work. It was really easy to do this without them finding out because of that. I'm not really sure for how long this went on, but I guess it went on for a fairly long time. My parents didn't notice how quickly we were going through cat food, or perhaps they didn't care anyway. I always wished I could let Sebastian into the house, but of course I couldn't do so. Every now and then, Sebastian would eat his food early, then jump up on the window ledge and look inside. Whenever he'd do this, I'd pet him for a while. One night, I was watching some late-night television in the dark when I heard some rustling going on outside near the front door. I figured it was Sebastian looking for his dinner, so I grabbed his bowl and filled it up. When I went outside, however, he was nowhere to be seen. I tried calling out for him in a quiet voice, but he still didn't show up. I guess I stupidly figured he might be hanging out in the bushes. That was silly, simply because there was no reason for him to do that. He would always run towards me for the food. I walked over to the side of the house and nearly fell over in shock when I saw a figure dressed all in black sneaking underneath one of our windows. Shocked, I dropped the food. The man looked over to me. It only took a few moments for our mutual shock to fade and for him to immediately make a rush towards me. Having already dropped the cat food, I twisted around and quickly ran back to the house, screaming for my dad. I got to the door, opened it, and ran inside. I attempted to close it, but the guy shoved his arm in first. He grabbed the door and began trying to pull it open. We struggled back and forth for a moment, until suddenly the living room light turned on. When the light turned on, the would-be burglar realized he would be caught. He cut his losses and let go of the door. He jumped off the porch and ran for the hills, so to speak. My dad did call the cops. And to my surprise, the guy was actually caught as well. Sebastian did come back later to get his food too, although I was scared to go outside again. Still though, I put out his meal, and he was a very happy cat that night. Well, telling this story is going to date me a bit, I guess, but this happened when I was about 15 years old. I had been having a pretty severe case of insomnia, and as anyone who has suffered from insomnia knows, you can only lay in bed for so long before you just have to give up and find something to do. To let you know a little bit more about the situation, this happened in the summer. My parents were not home this night, as they had gone to a party. Knowing my father, he had probably gotten so drunk as well that they weren't going to be coming home anytime soon. He was one of those guys to get trashed, then refused to know when it was time to leave. Because of this, I was home all alone. I had actually started to drift off a bit when my body jerked. I'm sure you've had this happen before. It woke me up, and after that I wasn't able to get back to sleep. I tossed and turned and tossed and turned. Finally, I rolled over and looked at my clock. It was just a couple of minutes before 11:30 p.m. I figured I might as well get up for a bit and watch The Tonight Show. Maybe Johnny Carson would help me relax and put me to sleep. I walked up the hallway and into the living room without turning on any of the lights. I turned the TV on, then flopped down on the couch and stretched out a bit. I watched Johnny and began to feel a whole lot better after the beginning of the show. I went to turn the TV off and apparently got a bit of a static shock. This caused me to pull my hand away from the TV. Because of the suddenness of this action, I turned around, only to see, facing the couch, to my horror, a man hiding on the far side, crouched down in the small space between the wall and the couch. I screamed in shock. The man actually looked pretty surprised himself as well. I quickly sprinted out of the room and into the kitchen. My intent was to grab a knife. I found a big cleaver easily. I flipped the lights on and ran back into the living room to confront the man. The door was wide open, and the man had fled into the night. I called the cops as I did a thorough check of the house with cleaver in hand. The man was definitely gone now. All I could figure is he must have seen my parents' car gone, and the lights were out. He must have thought no one was home and tried to rob us. When he heard me get up, he didn't have time to get out of the house, so he hid in the corner. I don't think he expected me to stay up from insomnia and watch a whole hour of television. The man had been trapped there the entire time I was watching Johnny Carson. The man was right behind me, crouched in my house only a few feet away. And I never knew. I would have never known if I hadn't turned around from that sudden static shock. I used to get into a lot of fights with my stepmother. Things were pretty crappy at home ever since she married my dad. I asked my mom if I could come stay with her for a while, but it seemed she was too busy to house me. It really sucked, honestly. Things just got more and more difficult, and it eventually all came to a head when my stepmom accused me of stealing something from her. Of course, I hadn't done this, but my dad immediately believed her over me, and we got into a huge fight about it. I really couldn't take it anymore. After they went to sleep, I packed up a duffel bag and a tiny bit of money I had, and left for a couple of nights on my own. I was able to sleep at a friend's house at first, but I was only 16, so that really didn't last very long at all. After about 4 or 5 nights, I was faced with the harsh reality of sleeping on the streets. It scared me for sure, but not enough to make me go home after that big argument. My first night on the streets, though, was probably worse than you can ever imagine. It was just a complete nightmare. I didn't really sleep at all. I tried to sleep at the train station at first, but the doors were locked, so I slept outside instead. I felt myself drifting off a few times, but I really couldn't get any sleep. I did have a little bit of money on me, so the next day I took the train into the city. I figured there would be more places to sleep there. It turned out I was right. The following night, I found myself holed up in an alleyway, and I curled up next to the garbage can. I actually did manage to sleep for a while, before I felt a sharp tapping wake me up. I jumped and grabbed my bag. There was a girl there who also looked homeless. She was fairly nice actually though, and told me it was dangerous to sleep in such a place. She told me there was a nicer place nearby where people were squatting, and she asked me if I wanted to accompany her. Although I was scared at first, I realized it might be better to get some sleep with other people around. I went there with her. I followed her there. There were a lot of people squatting in this old home actually. It seemed kind of weird actually. People were grouped together in circles talking quietly. I really didn't know how much more comfortable I was going to be there than in the alleyway, but she took me into a room that only 2 other guys were in. It seemed she knew them all, and they all welcomed me with friendly smiles. They wanted to know if I wanted to hang out. I found out a few minutes later she would be doing heroin with them. I let them know I was only interested in sleeping. I was not into the whole idea of getting hooked on drugs. I was so tired though that them doing heroin in the same room didn't even bother me. I figured I wasn't going to do it, so it was no big deal. I went into the corner for a little bit. I actually watched what they were doing. I was tired, yeah, but I guess now I was also a bit scared of them and curious about how they were doing this. It was hard to watch, especially when the girl did it. I mean, she had been nice before, but now she was just acting all weird and crazy. I liked her because she had helped me, but I didn't want to be anywhere near her in this moment. Watching them all shoot that stuff up was really hard, but after a while, I actually managed to doze off a bit. Later though, I felt someone up against me, which woke me up almost immediately. I opened my eyes, and it was the girl from before. She smiled at me, and I did too. I was just about to close my eyes when she rubbed my pants a bit. We were both too out of it to do anything though, so she fell asleep right on top of me. Later on though, I felt someone tugging at my arm or doing something with it. It was really annoying. I thought it must have been the girl who had woken up since though. I tried to keep the sleep going, but I woke up immediately when I felt a sharp pain shoot through my arm. Opening my eyes, I saw a much older man standing over me. I hadn't seen it before. Right in my face though, he had pulled my shirt sleeve up and put some sort of band on my arm. It only took a few moments for me to realize this guy was going to shoot me up with heroin while I was sleeping. "What the hell are you doing?" I screamed. I tried to pull my arm away from him. "I'm gonna kill you like you killed her," he said, motioning towards the girl. I looked over at her only to see she was lying with her head against the wall, clearly breathing perfectly fine. I pointed out to the man that she was still alive, but the man grabbed hold of my arm even tighter. Most of what happened next was almost a blur. He had a needle at the ready, but I resisted as hard as I could. Eventually, I got a good kick on the guy, and he let go of me with his hand. I grabbed my bag and sprinted out of the house. I kept running until I found a place to hide until the following morning. The following day, I found a shelter for runaway teens and stayed there for as long as they would let me. It was a long time, and there was no happy ending to be found anytime soon. I never went back to my parents, and I didn't see them for years, actually. I lived in shelters, hopping back and forth, until I eventually got a job and then an apartment and made something with my life in the end. Things got really bad after my dad died. My mom fell into a deep depression for years. She ended up marrying this awful guy who just used her all the time and hated us kids. It really sucked because she would have never given a guy like him the time of day beforehand. Things got really rough for me and my brothers and sisters. As the oldest, I did my best to try and protect the others, but it didn't really work. When I was 15, my stepdad hit my younger brother, and he and I got into an all-out fist fight. My mom immediately took his side when she came home from work and kicked me out of the house. I literally had nowhere to go. We had moved a lot of times after my dad passed away, and I really didn't have any good friends because of this. We didn't have any family nearby either. We lived a bit out in the country, so it wasn't like there were shelters or anything nearby. I spent a couple of days wandering around in the hills. Actually, it was the only thing I could think to do. There were multiple abandoned buildings I'd found that I could sleep in for a little while. There were also plenty of creeks with fresh water to drink. This was in the late spring, too, so there were some apple trees I could steal apples from. You might be surprised about how I didn't run into any people for a long time. Hell, it was surprising to me, too. There were tons of hills, though, and they went on and on and on. Even with nobody around to worry about, though, it was still hell. I had to sleep with a tiny blanket I had packed and used my jacket for a pillow. I slept on the splintered floors of these abandoned little sheds, or whatever they happened to be. The whole time, I was worried someone would stumble down from the mountains and catch me or something. One evening, I was sitting back in a small building, reading a book by flashlight. That was when I heard a strange sound, like a man groaning or something. I got up and looked out the window on the door of the shed. It was extremely dark outside, but I did just about manage to make out a shadowy figure of someone standing about 50 yards away. I quickly turned off my light. I had put a padlock on the door. I had brought one with me for safety when I got kicked out. I had always planned to sleep in these abandoned houses if that ever happened, so I knew I would need some extra protection in the form of that padlock. I watched the man from inside the shed. He was walking around, but mostly in my direction. Now, this shed was quite old, and you could tell no one had used it in decades. This guy was coming right towards it, though, and he also seemed to have something ready in his hand. It was long, but I couldn't quite tell what it was. It might have been a gun or a particularly large knife. Who knows what? When I realized the guy was making a beeline towards the shed now, I did the only thing I could think to do. I took my blanket and went over to the farthest corner of the shed. I hid under the blanket and piled some dirt and random debris on top of me. I hoped in the dark he would not be able to distinguish me from my surroundings. I was too afraid to look out of my blanket to even see if he was there, though. It felt like a long time passed. I was just about to peek out from underneath when suddenly I heard some more sounds, as if someone was trying to bust open the door. They began pulling extremely hard, and I heard the lock jiggling back and forth. I began to get very scared. It was even worse, though, when the man began slamming something against the door. I almost crapped my pants as the pounding got fiercer and fiercer. He didn't begin yelling or anything, but rather started speaking in a strange gibberish I could not understand. I was scared and shivering. Whatever he was saying, he was clearly in some sort of tranquil fury. After a while, he stopped pounding. I thought he'd finally decided to give up, but he began to kick on the door and started yelling this time. I heard a gunshot and an awful guttural sound. I found out later that was a bullet going through the wood of the door. He shot the door several more times. I was crying silently in the shed, hoping he couldn't hear me. Not long after this flurry of shots, the man stopped pounding on the door. I was damn impressed with how strong that old rotting door was. That came later though. After he stopped pounding on the door, he must have walked away because it got real quiet. I waited there for what seemed like hours. It might have actually been hours now that I think about it. I thought maybe the guy was the owner of the land and the shed or something. Why else would this guy be out in the middle of the night in the mountains? Maybe he was some crazy hermit or wanderer or something. Whatever it was scary as hell. When I finally had the nerve to crawl out, I peeked through the window and saw that no one was there. Although I was terrified, I stayed in that shed for the rest of the night. The following day, I went home. Turns out my mom had been looking for me because her new husband had hit one of my other siblings while I was out. I guess she didn't realize that he was lying and kicked him out after. I can't lie to you, it was extremely hard to forgive her, but I eventually did so, and I was just happy to be home at the end of the day. There was a time when I left home as a teenager. I don't want to get into the specifics too much. It was a real nasty time, and my parents seemed real nasty to me too. Looking back, it was probably just as much my fault though as it was theirs. I was a bit of a jerk. Anyway, we got into this big, huge fight, and I told them I was going to leave. They said, "Well fine, see what it's like out there on your own." I decided to do just that. I thought everything would be fine. I went to live with a guy named Chaz. He had been a pretty cool guy in all the time I'd known him. He lived alone with his father, who was barely ever home anyway. Seemed like the ideal situation to me. They lived out in a rural area, in a beautiful home. We knew each other really well, so he let me crash on his bedroom floor without much fuss. That was fine with me. I really didn't know much about Chaz's father though. What was stranger was that Chaz wouldn't tell me much about him either. I even asked him one time what his dad did for a living, and he basically said he didn't even know. I found that especially odd, but he said they didn't really spend much time together. He told me he pretty much had to raise himself, as his dad was basically never there. He just gave him money whenever he asked for it. Anything else was pretty much all up to him. Eventually, his father did show up, and I ended up having a weird little interaction with him. He seemed to have known I had been there for a good 2 months before I had this freaky experience. Chaz and I were up late watching movies in the living room when his dad just suddenly came home. He just ripped open the door without even saying anything. I was a bit afraid of the way the man was stomping around. I thought he might have been angry that I was staying there with him, but he just left the room. When he came back around, he was carrying some sort of semi-automatic rifle with him. He told us in an angry voice to either go to Chaz's room or stay away from the windows and get down. I wanted to run and hide immediately, but Chaz didn't want to go to his room and locked it with several different locks. I watched him carefully, seeing him pacing in front of the house back and forth. After a while, I saw a light of what seemed to be several pickup trucks pulling up to the home. The light shone in through the living room window and nearly blinded me. I asked Chaz if we should get the hell out of there right now. He simply told me not to worry about it, and this had happened several times before. It was likely not going to turn into anything. I heard Chaz's dad screaming some things at the guys in the trucks. I heard them yelling back at him. I couldn't really understand what any of them were saying though. I took Chaz's word that this wasn't that big a deal, but it wasn't easy to do that, especially when I heard a few gunshots ring out in the night. After a few seconds, multiple gunshots started ringing out. I jumped up in surprise, but Chaz shoved me back down. He said they were simply warning shots, and I shouldn't get so uppity about something like this. Happens all the time, he said. A couple of moments later, an absolute hellfire of gunshots rang out. Apparently, those were just shots in the air too. I mean, they must have been, because they didn't seem to actually hit anything, and no one was crying out in pain or seemed to be shot. Chaz was eerily calm throughout this entire thing. That was probably the most unnerving thing to me. His dad was out on the front yard having a gun standoff with several armed men in pickup trucks, and he just sat there eating popcorn and watching a movie. I don't really have words for how scary this was. There was a long while of more gunshots, and eventually the truck sped off in a hurry. Chaz's dad came back inside with his gun. He didn't say anything to either of us. He just walked down to the basement, and that was the last time I saw him all night. I asked Chaz to explain what the hell just happened, and he seemed pretty disinterested. All he would tell me was that his dad worked with some guys, and they often had clashes like this. He said it wasn't unusual or even uncommon. No one ever really got shot too badly or hurt, though. He told me to just ignore it the next time it happened. I had to stay with Chaz for a long time because of circumstances, so this incident actually did repeat itself several times. They never told me what exactly was going on with these armed standoffs, but as weird as it seems, as it went on, I really did start to become more like Chaz and just ignore the whole situation. It was pretty surreal. My name is Nikki, and I had a really weird experience back when I was in college. It still haunts me to this day. When I was a freshman in college, I didn't get to experience the college experience the way many do. I didn't go to any of the football games, even though I'm a huge football fan. I didn't date any guys, and I didn't even go to a single party. I was so thoroughly concerned with succeeding academically that I put 100% of my focus into my schoolwork. It really paid off, and I did get straight A's all year, but I really felt like I was missing out on what college was supposed to be. As a sophomore, I decided to take part more socially. Not having made many college friends, this wasn't very easy to get into. I attended a few football games by myself and tried to join some various clubs. I really had a problem connecting with a lot of the other members, though. Where I was successful in making friends, however, was in class. Several classes, when we were put together for group work or whatever, I was able to really connect with my fellow students. By October, in my first sophomore semester, I was successful in making quite a few friends, and I got invited to a Halloween party. I was nervous going, and I guess I was right to be. Although I got to talk with a lot of my friends, it was only for short periods of time. It was a pretty wild party as it turned out, and they had plenty of other people to talk to as well. There was this one guy who was dressed up as what I guess was some sort of anime character. I wasn't really sure. He kept looking at me from across the room before eventually coming up to me. He said his name was Chris and asked me what I was drinking. I was having a rum and coke, and he started talking about how much he liked that. He offered to go and get me a new drink. I was so happy at having someone talking to me that I accepted right away. He left, and a few minutes later, came back with 2 rum and cokes. He handed me mine, and he started drinking his. After a while, he seemed to be getting hit really hard from the alcohol. He began slurring his words strongly, and eventually started swaying from being dizzy. I assumed he was either a real lightweight, or he had been drinking a lot beforehand. When he slumped against the wall and seemed ready to pass out, I got really concerned. I didn't know what to do in this situation. I sought out one of my friends. I told them he had only had a single drink. They called an ambulance just in case. I'll never forget what happened in that moment. We laid him down on his side and went to check if he was alright by checking his vitals. They just so happened to run their hands over his pocket, where they found he had a bottle of Rohypnol hidden away. It was in his system as well when they did tests after. I had an idea about what happened after that. Rohypnol is a common date drug, you see. I think Chris had gone to get drinks, and both drinks were rum and cokes. He had roofied one of them, intending to give it to me, but he ended up forgetting which one it was. He ended up drinking the one with the drugs in it himself. I'll never forget how lucky I was that night. I don't know exactly why it is, but it seems that people are much more likely to order delivery pizza when it's stormy outside. Snowstorms, thunderstorms, it doesn't really matter. I often joke that they make bets to see if the delivery drivers have a wreck or something in the bad weather. By far the weirdest delivery I ever had to make, though, happened during one of the nastiest thunderstorms I'd ever experienced. It was completely dark outside, except for when the white lightning lit up the entire sky. The outside winds had to be a good 40 miles per hour. At one point, I got an order for a pizza to be delivered to an address I had never been to before. I even remember the exact order to this day: 2 large half pepperoni, half mushrooms with black olives. When I walked out to my car with the box, the wind almost decided to take the pizza and deliver it for me. It was an extremely difficult drive. With the rain and the wind, the wipers were on full speed, and I still had nearly zero visibility. It took all my focus to keep driving straight. To make matters worse, though, when I finally arrived at the address of the house was completely dark. Now, this story happened in the 80s, before everyone paid for their pizza online. I quickly expected it to be a prank. You know, call the pizza delivery driver to go out in nasty weather to a random address. As I pulled into the driveway, though, I noticed someone was out on the porch in the darkness, rocking back and forth in a rocking chair. I found this quite odd. I left my car lights on and stepped out of the car. I suppose the lights were a bad idea, really. I ran up onto the porch to get out of the rain. It was only as I was wiping the rain out of my eyes that I realized this was not a real person sitting in this rocking chair. It was like a Halloween dummy or some sort of crypt keeper looking character. There was only rocking because of the fierce winds. There was a sign tied to it that said to bring the pizza around back. I wasn't about to do that, though. Instead, I walked over to the door and knocked on it. There was no answer, so I knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. I was about to knock for a third and final time when out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone peek around the corner of the house. Come on, bring the pizza around back. They disappeared out of sight once again, behind the side of the house. There were no lights at all, other than from my car. I honestly stood there with a dumb look on my face before deciding what to do. Just as I was about to make a decision, though, I saw a hand wrap around and tap on the side of the house. Looking back, they beckoned me to them. This was way too weird. It was like something right out of a horror film. I took the pizza and hurried back to my car. I slammed the door. Right when I began to pull out, 4 huge guys rushed out from the side of the house. "Hey, he's leaving!" one of them yelled. They came rushing towards the car. I was already in, though, and this was not a horror movie, so I was able to start the car and pull away from them quite easily. I heard a crashing sound as I was leaving, though. Something hit my back window and shattered it in. I put the pedal to the metal and got out of there as fast as I could. My initial thoughts had been that this was a prank. However, I thought differently when they broke my back window. I reported the event to the police. Apparently, an old senior couple was supposed to live in that house, but they were currently on vacation. The house had not been broken into either. I'll never really know what those guys were up to for sure, and maybe it's better that way. I know a lot of people have a neighbor, or at least someone who lives in their neighborhood, that's quite a bit weird. When I was growing up, there was this one guy who lived down the block that just always gave me the creeps. The kids all had their stories about him. Also, as an adult, I'd like to think that the stories weren't true, but some of the strange things I'd seen this man do made it hard for me to believe they were fake either. Just to give you a few examples, several times I'd see him flying a kite in the middle of the night, just running up and down the middle of the street at midnight, trying to get his kite up in the air with no wind. It always seemed so odd to me. He'd also just watch people. I know some people like to sit on their porches and watch as people go by, but this guy took it a big step further. If you happened to be walking by the sidewalk in front of his house, his eyes and head would follow you. Then, once you passed by, he'd get up off the porch, walk down to the sidewalk, and follow you all the way until you turned onto another street. Then he'd stay at that street corner, watching you walk away. He'd never follow you after that first turn, though. It was just extremely strange. My weirdest experience with him happened when I was 16 years old. I had been staying over at my friend Chuck's house, playing video games. We'd of course lost track of time. It was about midnight or so when I saw a streak of lightning light up the sky. Of course, it was followed by the loud bang of thunder. I realized I was going to have to try and get home before the rain started pouring down. My parents had long since gone to bed. My friend's parents weren't exactly too keen on others spending the night there either. It wasn't too long after I'd set out on my way that it began raining too. It was light at first, just enough to make me worry, but then it began raining harder and harder. I decided that if I continued like this, I was going to get soaked and maybe even end up sick at the end of the day. I might as well try to not let it bother me though. It's not like I could turn around and go back. Of course, on the way there, I walked by that strange old man's house like usual. To my surprise, he was actually sitting on the porch, even though it was so late, and pouring like hell. Like usual, he never took his eyes off me while I walked by, but he did surprise me when he jumped off his porch without an umbrella or anything, and began following me through the pouring rain. I was already on edge about the storm, and this was just making it so much worse. I tried to ignore his presence behind me, and figured that once I'd turned the street, he would stop following me like always. The anxiety caused by the loud and booming lightning, though, really didn't lend itself to me feeling relaxed at all. I turned down my street, and after going a little ways down, I snuck a peek back over my shoulder. I was extremely surprised to see that the man was still following me down my own street. From there, I started running, and I didn't look back again. I just wanted to get to my house and out of the rain and away from this strange man. The problem with running in the rain, however, is of course that the ground is very slippery. I tried to cut through my yard, but I slipped on some mud and went crashing head first into the ground. I groaned for a moment, and that groan quickly became a cry when I felt the hands of the man grab me from behind. He flipped me over onto my back and began punching me in the face hard. "Stay the hell off my street!" he began screaming over and over into my face. He had these long, ragged fingernails, and they were scratching deep gashes into my face as he hit me. I didn't know what else to do other than scream for help. I don't know if it was my screams or the cracks of thunder that woke my father up, but he rushed out of the house, saw what was going on, and ran to grab the guy off me. The man kept screaming that I was on his street and to keep me off his damn street. The police arrested the guy, and I had to go to the emergency room. The man was found mentally unfit to stand trial and was committed to a psychiatric hospital. I never saw him again after, at least not for real, but every time a thunderstorm passed through my area, I could see his face in my mind. I was listening to some scary stories about drives down country roads, and I decided to share mine as well. One thing I've noticed in these stories, which has tended to be true of my own experiences driving down these roads, is that often they are very narrow, and sometimes you have to drive an extremely long way before you're able to find anywhere to turn around. Some rural roads I've been on have gone on for miles without coming to a driveway or any other turning point. I doubt that people who've not experienced driving on these roads would likely even believe that they exist. However, I've lived in areas where the dirt roads wind almost endlessly up into the hills. I had my own scary experience when I was just 13 years old. Yeah, I know what you're thinking right now. Why would a 13-year-old be driving a car in the first place? But where I grew up, that wasn't unusual. This was in the early 1970s. I'll tell you that my mom learned to drive when she was just 11. You weren't exactly going to come across police in waiting on these types of roads. So why did the driver's license even really matter, especially when there weren't going to be other people around on the road usually anyway? The police and everyone basically knew around here, but they weren't too likely to give you a ticket. Everyone was driving before they were old enough. When you turned off the main road onto the dirt road that led to my house, there was a really small convenience store there. My dad often sent me off to get some beer for him. Yeah, the store owner was also my aunt, and she knew I was getting it for my dad, so she always gave me the beer. I picked up the beer pretty quickly. I think my dad was probably pretty drunk as it was, though. I thought I'd take the car and go driving a little while myself, so I drove out onto the main road for a while. Then I turned off onto a country road I'd never been on before. It was pretty fun for me to do this. Find new places and explore areas I'd never been to. I thought the country road I lived on was small, but this one was barely large enough to fit the car on the road. The woods were really thick all around, and the further I went down this road, the more and more the road seemed to narrow. It seemed like the trees were almost converging onto the road, and more than once near the ending, a branch from a tree scraped against the window of my car as I drove along. This was extremely frustrating. I had to drive very slowly because of all the twists and turns in it. What the hell was I even supposed to do if another car came down the road? There was barely enough room to fit on the road, let alone room to turn. I had this horrible thought as well, that perhaps this road didn't lead anywhere at all. What would I do if it dead-ended? What if it used to lead to somewhere, but the forest had long since overgrown it? Worst of all, what if it led to somewhere that someone didn't want me to be? My dad had always told me that deep out in these hills, there were people you never wanted to meet up with. I didn't come across any other cars, but I did eventually come to a driveway. The problem, however, was that this driveway was gated off. I didn't see a house anywhere around either. I guess this could have just been a side road that led off to somewhere out on the hill, but it was either continue driving down the road I was already on, or find some way to use this driveway/side road to turn around. I nervously got out of the car. The gate was not locked, but it did have a bolt in it. I undid the bolt and opened the gate up. I kept looking around me, trying to see if anyone else was around. If they discovered what I was doing, who knows what would happen. I was getting into my car and turned around. I got my car out of the gate. I guess I should have just gone straight home, but I felt that I should at least go out and close it behind me. My car was now facing the opposite direction, so the only light I had to see by was my tail lights. I still felt obligated to shut it though. I got out and went over to close this gate. When I wrapped my hand around the bars though, I heard the unmistakable sound of a shotgun cocking. I had fired enough of them to know what that sounded like. I looked up, and by the meager red light of my taillights, I noticed someone standing not too far away. The red light made them look extremely intimidating, and they were definitely holding a gun. I watched them lower the gun and point it right at me. A lot of people instantly freeze when a gun is pointed at them. I didn't though. I let go of the gate and ran back to the car. No sooner than I'd slammed the door closed did I hear a shotgun blast ring out. Miraculously, it didn't hit me though. I took off as fast as I could down the narrow and dark road. The ride back home was terrifying, even scarier than it had been on the way there. I didn't calm down till I was back on the paved road and headed back to my own home. I told my dad what happened honestly. He was more upset it took me so long to get him his beer though. I grew up out in the country. My family was from a really low-income area, and most of us were on welfare. We had food stamps too. Even when I was young, so many of my relatives were always not working. It really wasn't until I was much older, but I realized it was normal for people to actually have a job. The world's a much different place now. I started chewing tobacco and even drinking beer around the age of 14. It didn't seem that weird to me, because everyone else was doing it too. I also started hanging out at my friends' houses and doing the same there. A lot of times I hung out at my friend Brandon's house. He lived out on the same ridge as I did. My mom had given me a ride to his place on this particular night, but it wasn't unusual for me to walk back and forth. It was easily a 5-mile walk through the hills, along a gravel road. I'd walked it both in the day and in the night. This happened on a night where me and my buddies were all hanging out at Brandon's house in his basement, drinking beer and playing video games. Of course, back then it was the Atari 2600. I actually ended up getting pretty damn drunk that night, and that was my downfall. Actually, normally I would get drunk, pass out, and then go home the next day. But on this night, me and Brandon got into a stupid drunken fight. I got angry at him and stormed out of his house at 2 a.m. Being drunk, I stayed angry for quite a while as well. By the time I'd finally begun to get over it though, I was too embarrassed to just go back to his house. I decided the best thing to do was continue walking home. It was a pretty hot summer night. Thank God the wind was blowing really hard. It probably kept me from working up too much a sweat and overheating that night. It might have been the alcohol or something, but I was getting a bit nervous for some reason as I was walking home. It was a really creepy night, like something from a movie. The sky was overcast, but there was a full moon, and the clouds were moving fast. They'd cover and uncover the moon quickly. Most houses on the ridge were set on the hills. They were all dark when I came by them. There were also some older abandoned small buildings closer to the road. If you've ever driven down an old country road, you've probably seen a rather degraded small building. I was approaching one of them. It was a few yards off the road, a building I'd seen and passed by many times without incident. Only this time there was something different. There was a light on inside it. I had just seen the light on in the house, and it made me extremely apprehensive as I was walking down the road. If someone was inside doing something in that house, they were close enough by the road to see me walking by. It was near 3 a.m. by that time. I couldn't imagine what they were doing in this abandoned building in the middle of the country. I couldn't imagine it was anything good either. I tried to walk further to the far side of the road and did my best to hide away in the darkness, walking quietly past the building. I really didn't want to get the attention of the person in that shack. I was quite curious about what may have been going on inside though. As the shack got closer and closer, I still couldn't make out anyone inside the building from where I was. I'd actually walked off the side of the road now, into the grass to slightly conceal myself. I kept on glancing, passing by. I saw movement in the building. I was about to get a closer look when I heard the most horrifying and blood-curdling scream I'd ever heard in my entire life. It nearly knocked me off my feet in surprise. Then I saw two of the biggest, scariest-looking country boys I'd ever seen. They passed by the window, and I thought I saw one of them look out at me. I wasn't sure if he'd actually seen me though. I just ran and took off down the street. I had never been so scared in my life. I couldn't look back because I knew if I did, I would see those guys running right after me. I just kept running until my sides began cramping. I kept running until my feet hurt, and I still kept running. I ran until I made it home and immediately threw up in the yard. I don't know what I witnessed that night. I don't want to know. I never walked past that building again at night. I did walk past it during the day. Several times I wanted to go inside and see if anything was still in there, but I never did. I was too scared and horrified of what I might find. One of my favorite hobbies is going out and exploring old abandoned buildings. Of course, that sort of thing just breeds scary stories. I used to explore in more urban areas, but they're not nearly as fascinating as old rural buildings. I belong to several groups that like to explore these sorts of old areas. Members would often suggest to others the locations of cool abandoned buildings, so they can be further explored and experienced. The strangest thing I ever explored was not actually a building, though. This occurred in a rural area in Maine. The area is actually very good for exploring, as there are tons of abandoned barns and all sorts of old buildings out there. I was looking for one of these old barns when I lost track of where I was. I'm not sure how much you know about Maine, but it has a very large amount of forested area. It's definitely not the kind of place you want to get lost in. I'd also never really gotten lost like this before, at least not as significantly as I was that day. As I wandered around the woods, I thought my main goal should be trying to locate this particular barn. I knew the way to get there, so arguably if I found it, I should be able to deduce my way back out of the woods from there. I didn't find it as I was wandering, though. I found something even stranger. I found what appeared to be a set of random old cellar doors. There was no building or even an old foundation around, as far as I could tell. It was just a random pair of cellar doors set in the ground. I began thinking that maybe me getting lost was a good thing. When I did get out of here, I would have a good story to tell all the others. I could see right away there were no locks on the doors. For some reason, they were a bit hard to get open though. When I finally did, I was surprised they didn't fall apart altogether. The steps led down into a really dark and dank area that I couldn't see in at all. I took out my flashlight and slowly entered this cellar. Walking down those stairs was quite a freaky experience. They creaked and bent under every step from my weight. I had no idea where they were leading, other than to an underground area. The cellar was quite interesting. I can't even really begin to describe it. It had an earthen floor, wooden support beams, and shelves made up the majority of the walls. Surprisingly, there was even an old bed laid up against one of them. There was also a table that was cluttered with various objects. Walking over to the table, I soon got the shock of my life. There were two things laying on top I would have never expected. One thing was the decayed remains of what was clearly a human hand. That was freaky enough, but the far scarier thing was a newspaper that was dated from only 3 days ago. That meant that not only was someone keeping a decaying human hand around, but they had recently been in that cellar. Shocked, I immediately went back to the stairs and tried to make my way out of that area. I almost expected one of the weak stairs to break under my weight as I hurried back up the steps. I got to the top and looked all around to see if anyone was watching. I quietly closed the door and hurried back into the woods as quickly as I could. The walk back was very nerve-wracking. I know it's cliché to tell you this, but I thought every sound I heard was the inhabitant of that cellar coming back. I had no idea if they were directly responsible for whatever events led to someone losing their hand, but I certainly didn't want to stick around to find out. It took me 2 hours to find my way back to my vehicle. It was completely dark by the time I got there. I was so on edge that I had to check the back seat of my car for intruders. I even looked under my car. That's how unnerved I was. That was the last time I ever went exploring in that area. My parents bought an old house when I was 10 years old. My dad had gotten a really good job. and wanted to buy a bigger place for us to move into. The house was quite huge. It was old as well, but kept in a really good condition. It was so big that all of us kids even got our own room. We had a huge attic to keep all of our storage. In this house was also a very large and dark basement. It was completely empty though. The really interesting thing about the basement though was a small door located on one of the walls. It was locked when we moved in, and my dad had never been given a key for it. We had no way to open it. That little door became something of a fascination for me, my brothers, and my sisters. My dad tried to tell us, don't let your imaginations run wild now. He said it was likely just a small room that had tools in it, or maybe it had nothing at all. Yeah, telling us not to let our imaginations run wild, that pretty much just ensured that was the very thing that was going to happen. Growing up, we all used to tell all sorts of stories about what could possibly be behind this mystery door. My brother said it was a room that children would hide in when their parents were angry and fighting, like some sort of child panic room. The others all had their own ideas about what it could have been, but I don't want to bore you with all that. From age 10 to 16, I would have never considered trying to break down the door or trying to pick the lock or anything. I wasn't scared of my dad, but I knew that if I broke into it after he repeatedly insisted we don't, he would be pretty angry with me and I'd get in a lot of trouble. It was when I was 17 and I was home alone that I finally found out what was in that room. My family was all out of town, and I had a few friends over. After a lot of horsing around, my buddy began talking about the door. We all got really curious, and he kept insisting I try and get it open. I refused at first, telling him my dad would get very angry with me. When that didn't work, I told him the door was much more interesting when we didn't know what was really in there. That didn't work either. None of my excuses seemed to faze my friends, and I had to admit, I really wanted to know what was on the other side. We all snatched up some tools and decided to go open it up ourselves. I won't go into too much detail explaining how we did it, although it did take quite a long time to get through. Finally, though, we did get to the other side, where I saw the weirdest thing I had ever seen in my life. It was an extremely small room. I mean, I would have been too big at that age to even fit into myself. There was no lighting, so I had to use a flashlight to see around. There were what seemed to be words scrawled all over the walls. It was smeared with either blood or red paint. I told myself it was red paint. However, the decaying corpses of several birds and small animals were laying in a disgusting pile in the corner of this small room. That indicated that maybe these red smears on the wall could be bird blood. The weirdest thing, though, was there was a small child-sized rocking chair facing the far wall of the tiny room. There appeared to be a doll on the chair. Turning the chair around, I saw the doll was covered with what I assumed to be bird crap. Its eyes had been ripped out of their sockets, and they had been filled with blood that had long since dried. It had scratches on its face and rips in its clothes. It was missing both of its legs, below where the knees should have been. It was a freaky thing and pretty damn weird to just stumble upon. I didn't take anything out of the room. I closed and relocked the door because I didn't want my dad to get angry at me for opening it. That discovery created so many questions, though, that to this day I have no answers to. The weirdest thing of all was it made me more uncomfortable than I had been previously, when I had no idea what was behind that door. I remember growing up in the 1980s and having things so different than they are right now. My family didn't even have air conditioning back then. It seems so basic nowadays. There also wasn't as much to do inside. There wasn't a proliferation of video games or movies or TV shows. I think about 5 people in the entire world had the internet back then. Summer vacations were often very dull because of this, and always pretty hot and sweaty too. When I was 13 years old, I began hanging out with a guy named Jack. He was a bit more daring than I ever was. One night, we were deep into summer break and watching some movies on our newfangled VCR or whatever it was called, as well as completely sweating our butts off. On this hot summer night, Jack had a sudden idea. He thought the two of us could go down to the local swimming pool, hop over the gate, and cool off inside. While I didn't really enjoy the idea of trespassing, it wasn't too difficult for him to convince me. It was about midnight when we finally arrived at the pool. It was completely dark out, and the fence surrounding the pool was decently high. It wasn't anything a couple of teenage boys would have a problem figuring out though. Jack and I quickly scaled the fence and set ourselves down in the pool area. Our local pool had a tendency to get very busy during the day, so having it all to ourselves was quite a surreal experience. We were already in our swimsuits, so we quickly jumped into the water. It felt so much better than I can even begin to explain. Jack and I had a lot of fun at the pool. We did cannonballs, blasted a lot of water around, and just had a great time. After a while, I dared Jack to do something that neither of us had ever had the courage to do. I dared him to jump off the highest diving board. I could kind of tell he didn't really want to, but as I mentioned, Jack was more of the adventurous type than me. He eventually gave in with pressure, and I stayed at the opposite end of the pool. My back was to the pool building, where the showers were, and the entrance to the pool as well. Jack slowly climbed up to the top of the ladder. He was watching his feet the entire time, not really looking in my direction. I could tell he was scared going up there, but he was trying his best not to let on. Once he got to the top, he slowly began walking out on the board again. His eyes were constantly on his feet, and he wasn't really paying attention to me at all. It wasn't until I yelled at him, daring him to just do it, that he finally looked up from his feet and over at me. It was hard telling from such a distance, but Jack suddenly looked very alarmed and almost downright scared. He made a motion towards me, but then slipped on the board and fell into the water. Fortunately, he fell forward and didn't hit any part of his body on the pool's edge. He did hit the water pretty hard though. I immediately began swimming for my friend. He didn't resurface very quickly, but fortunately for him, I was the best swimmer I knew. I dived down and found him struggling to swim back to the surface. I grabbed on and pulled him back up and out of the water, dragging him onto the cement. Jack was panicked, but that made sense because he'd just had a pretty harrowing experience. I soon learned, though, that wasn't why he was so on edge. He jumped up to his feet, went to grab his shoes and shirt, and told me to get mine as well. I hesitated, not exactly sure what had Jack so excitable. He yelled at me to do what he told me right now. I did so quickly. We went to the fence, and I cut myself on a barb this time as we jumped over. Jack jumped from the top of the fence down to the ground. He twisted his ankle slightly, but that didn't stop him from running. When we finally got back to my place, Jack finally told him what caused him to fall and be so alarmed when he looked at me. He'd seen a man approaching me silently from behind, holding what looked like a small hatchet. The man had emerged from the showers and was only a few steps away from me, raising his hatchet to attack when Jack had fallen in. That caused me to immediately swim away from the man. When I pulled him out, the man was not there anymore. He thought he saw the man hiding in the shadows of the room though, waiting for us to go through it. Regardless, he wanted to get over that gate and out of that place immediately. Normally, I might not have believed him. It seemed like such an outlandish story. I mean, why would this random guy with a hatchet be in the locker room of the local swimming pool at that time? But even 30 years later, he maintained it was absolutely true. And the reason I believe him is that my buddy is not the type to get scared of much of anything. Decades later, though, this story still freaks him out the very same as that night, so I'm pretty sure he's telling the truth. I bought my first home about 10 years ago. It was a townhouse with 3 stories and a basement. I also had a tiny fenced-in backyard. I wasn't really great at meeting new people, so I really didn't know how to go about introducing myself to the neighbors. I didn't really have to make the first introduction though. I was in the backyard getting ready to give the very small lawn a mowing when I heard someone behind me call out to me. After a brief startle, I turned around and noticed a man, maybe in his mid-60s, standing in the backyard of the adjacent house. We made pleasant introductions and the usual neighborly small talk. I told him where I was from and what I did for a living. He told me how long he'd been living in the house he owned and what the neighborhood was like. It was a very friendly talk. However, strangely enough, he asked me, "Did you hear about what happened in your basement?" I had no idea what he meant by that. I told him the basement was completely fine, but he insisted and asked if I had heard what happened in it. I told him no and asked for him to elaborate. Instead, he shook his head and told me it would be a good idea to talk to my realtor for the whole story. Apparently, they're required by law to tell me those sorts of things. He didn't want to get into it himself. Looked like it was something unpleasant he didn't want to talk about. It was quite a weird experience, but I tried not to think too much about it. Even if something had happened in my basement, that was all in the past. I wasn't too worried about it, and thus I did not call my realtor, nor did I ever talk to my neighbor about it again. He didn't bring it up again either in the couple of months after I'd moved in. An odd experience took place one night, though, when I had some family over to see the house. We had a small barbecue in the backyard. The neighbor that had told me about the basement initially, his name was Mike. He was over as well, hanging out with me. He did not bring up the basement at all once again. I guess he felt that whatever had happened was just between me and the people who sold me the house. After everyone had left after having stayed up late drinking beer together and talking, I was still in the backyard cleaning everything up. It was dark outside, but I had a nice patio light that kept the place looking really good. I was cleaning up the grill facing the house, when suddenly something caught my eye. I quickly glanced over at the basement door, where I very distinctly saw the face of a young lady pressed up against the window of the basement. This person was clearly watching me as well. I was so startled I literally fell backwards on my butt. Despite that, I looked back at the door and distinctly saw this lady watching me and following me with her eyes. After a few moments, though, the person turned away from me and appeared to walk down the basement stairs on the other side of the door. I didn't have my cell phone on me. The basement wasn't accessible from the house either, so I didn't have to worry about someone sneaking into my home or something. I ran up the stairs to my back door, got on the phone, and called the police about the incident. I kept an eye out the back window to see if the lady had at any point tried to leave. I didn't see her doing that, though. The police soon arrived, and I gave them the basement key. They went down there and found nothing out of the ordinary. One of the officers even copped a bit of an attitude with me, thinking I knew the history of the house and that I was playing a prank on them. I had no idea what they were talking about. It was then explained to me that 20 years ago, the house was empty. A woman in the neighborhood had been kidnapped while out on a jog and kept in the basement. When someone finally broke in, she was unfortunately found dead down there. I was unaware of any of this, however. Many people in the town knew about it, so they may have just been playing a prank on me. I don't know, but I never saw anyone in the basement ever again.